Get us shared here. First of all, thank you guys for having me and joining us today. This will be a super fun presentation, I think. I set this up to be multimedia. So there's going to be videos and pictures and documents and audio. So turn your audio up and be a little bit patient because the videos take a couple seconds to queue up. So let's get started. World War I ravaged Europe from July 28, 1914 until November 11, 1918. The US did not enter the war until 1917. And so I want us to take a look at why we waited until 1917 to enter and what happened to the troops that we sent over there from the United States to Europe to fight in the First World War.
To April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality, but neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that these allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
So now we get to see a little bit about why we entered, why we waited a long time. Some of it had to do with the Civil War being so horrific that the United States was actually scared to enter another war. The United States begins putting out posters like these, encouraging good behavior amongst veterans and a message of get back to work. But what were the troops really like when they got back to the United States? So I'm going to play this video while we're talking about this, but I want you to watch it and kind of listen to what I'm saying too. Upon return, many soldiers suffered from something called shell shock. As you're seeing in this video, shell shock was a mixture of neurological disorders caused by physical trauma from being near bombs and mental illness brought on by warfare. In today's terms, we recognize this as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. A study in 1921 estimated that around 76,000 American veterans had been officially diagnosed with shell shock. Shell shock became well known across the country and included a diagnosis of paralysis, blindness, tremors, nightmares, and anxiety. In the 1920s and 1930s, shell-shocked veterans led the public to question the government's commitment and responsibility to provide long-term care for veterans. On May 2nd, 1922, a Hearst newspaper truck from New York City delivered a petition to the U.S. Capitol that had more than 1 million signatures on it. The document simply said, "We respectfully petition Congress to pass the Soldiers' Bonus Act without further delay, and also to levy a sales tax to obtain the money to pay the bonus." So now I have a question for you guys, and I want you to talk about it here for like 2 minutes with your peers in class, and tell me, do you have the right to petition the government? Do you have the right to petition the government? All right, everybody give me thumbs up if you think the answer is yes. And everybody who thinks the answer is no, give me a thumbs down. All right, can I get someone to unmute their mic from someone that had a thumbs up and let me know where this right is found? Where can we find this right?
Where's it found? First Amendment.
The First Amendment, very good. It's in the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is really important for understanding what's going to happen in the bonus march, because there's 2 rights in there that the marchers want to use. Number 1, it says you have the right to peaceably assemble. And number 2, you have the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. And so this is the First Amendment up here. So Congress actually passed a bonus in 1922, but President Warren Harding vetoed this bill. So they try again. And in 1924, Congress passes another bill. So I want to show you guys what a bill looks like, because I think this is a really cool part of being a historian. We get to like touch the documents and feel them, right? So this is the Soldiers' Bonus Act, and this is from the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center's website. And this is what a bill looked like in the 1920s. It's what a bill looks like today when we pass it. And they're all bound and put into books, and you can find them online. And this is what the front of, oops, I'm sorry. This is what the front of the bill also looks like. It shows you it's an act. This is how it's passed around to members of Congress. This website is really cool. I would encourage all of you to visit it. You can see letters from soldiers asking for the bonus. You can see some signatures on petitions. It's really a cool website. So when we go back, Coolidge, President Coolidge, now we've had Warren Harding has vetoed the bill. Now President Coolidge vetoed the bill. But President Coolidge said something really insulting to the veterans too. He said, "Patriotism bought and paid for is not patriotism." Ouch, he accused them of not being patriots. That's pretty harsh. So I'm gonna kick this question back to you guys. How many votes are needed to override a presidential veto? So if someone knows, you can unmute your mic and tell us.
Quick, how many people are needed?
2/3. You are absolutely right. 2/3. So fun fact, presidents have vetoed 1,484 bills, and Congress has only overridden 106 of them. And that's today. That's not back then. That's today. So this bonus bill was one of those that was overridden by Congress. So let's take a look at this bonus bill. This is what the bill looks like on the left, the adjusted service certificate that was sent to every veteran. And on the right is the letter that they all received from the Veterans Bureau. The payment provided veterans $1.25 per day for service overseas and $1 per day for domestic service. That means in the United States. The bonus would not pay out until each veteran's birthday in 1945, or it would pay out to his estate if he died before then. Bonuses totaling more than $50 or less were paid in cash, but bonuses over $50 were awarded as certificates payable in 20 years to limit government spending. There were 3,662,374 adjusted service certificates issued, and that's the bond. With a combined face value of $3.64 billion. In today's dollars, that would be $54 billion. Congress established a trust fund to receive 20 annual payments of $125 million that, with interest, would finance the 1945 disbursement of the $3.638 billion to veterans. So if we want to take a closer look at this, we can see here, it explains how the bill or how the bonus is going to be paid. And you can see the 36 years, the loan basis per dollars, the number of years, and how they were going to pay it over time. And then you can see here, it shows us the letter that's sent. Now, this amounted to about $1,000 per veteran, and that's equal to about $16,000 in today's money. On October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed on what would become to be known as Black Tuesday. This is often recognized as the start of the Great Depression, but I want you guys to remember it's not the cause of the Great Depression. Just when we look back, we say, this is really where we can start to see the decline of the economy, is with this. But there was economic indicators before this happened. And what you guys are looking at is newspapers from around the country that show the kind of panic that gripped the United States when the stock market started to crash, and it was in people's face that this was happening, right? The economy continues to slide for many years following the Great Depression. In March of 1930, President Hoover said the worst was over and the economy would start to improve. Did the economy start to improve in 1930? No, it got way worse for many, many years. By 1931, there are food riots, banks are failing, and unemployment was about 15.83%. More than 8 million Americans were out of work. In 1929, for comparison, unemployment was at 3.14%. By 1932, unemployment was at 25.53%. More than 12 million Americans would not have a job. Can you imagine? Like, just think about that for a minute. That would mean about 25% of your classmates, their parents wouldn't have jobs. It was a really rough time. And you can see in the pictures, there's billboards that say jobless men keep going. There's a bread line. These popped up all over the United States where we were feeding men bread and soup and families to keep people fed. And then you see these boys, and this is actually from one of the bonus army camps that we'll look at. but it says Hoover's Poor Farm. Hard times are still hoovering over us. Does anybody know? You can unmute yourself. Do you know what people called the shacks that they lived in during the Great Depression?
Hoovervilles.
Hoovervilles. They called them Hoovervilles. They named them after President Hoover. He happened to be the president at the time, so he got the name, I guess. So at this point, veterans could borrow up to 22.5% of the face value of their certificate, those bonus certificates. In 1931, Congress upped that amount to 50%. So now they can get 50% of this bonus. Some members of Congress, however, supported 100% payout of the veterans bonus. But this is where it starts to get tricky, because the question arises, who is going to pay for this? This is a lot of money. So Hoover wanted to find out, and so he did his research. He didn't just make a decision. So in this letter that's up here, Hoover requests information from the Veterans Bureau about how veterans are being treated. And you can see in the language of this, he says he wants to know what injustices exist in different forms of service to our veterans. So he's really concerned about how these veterans are being treated. And remember, we saw that video of shell shock. A lot of veterans were coming home with that, and the public reaction was to question, what is the government doing for them? Hoover then requests information from the Department of the Treasury to gauge the financial impact of paying out the bonus early. The Treasury states that it will cost $112 million, with the cost rising to $235 million annually. It is determined that individual taxes would need to be raised to cover the expense when the Treasury believes the tax rate should be lowered to help relieve the economy. Because remember, we're in the Great Depression. So I want you guys to reflect on this for a moment. Do you think it's fair to raise taxes on Americans during the Great Depression to pay for World War I bonus that has always been promised to be paid in 1945? Because right now it's 1931. So we're many years ahead. So just keep that in mind. Do you think that's fair to Americans? So the next set of documents, take a look at how many veterans are receiving relief through organized charities, such as the Red Cross. And the reason we're looking at that is because at this time, there's no Social Security, there's no food stamps, there's no welfare, and there's no unemployment insurance. So if you lost your job and you were hungry, the only people you could depend on was your community charities to support you. You can see in these document lists, and I'll kind of pull them up here, the city, the total population, the estimated military population, and the number of veterans who are receiving relief. This is before computers or the internet, so there's really no way for them to share this information without just doing this research. So I want to take a quick pause here for a minute, because things are going to start happening very quickly from this point forward. The time we've spent up until now was building context. Context tells us what is going on leading up into an event, and then we can think about what's going on right now. 1931 going into 1932, we saw the US entry to World War I. We saw veterans suffering from shell shock. We have seen Congress back and forthing about this bonus bill, two presidents vetoing it. We see Hoover's doing research, and we see that veterans want their bonus again. So what I want us to do right now is I'm going to ask each school to think about this. Big C context is the big picture. What's going on in the United States right now? Little C context we're going to look at is what is going on in the world for World War I veterans and what is going on in the world for Herbert Hoover, President Herbert Hoover. So what I want us to do is I want Galileo to tackle what is going on in big C context. What's going on in the United States right now? Talk about it. I'm going to come back and call on you guys first in about 3 minutes. Farmington, my homeschool student, I want you to think about little C context. What's going on for World War I veterans? And then Landisville, I want you guys to talk about what's going on in little C context for President Hoover. And I'm going to give you guys, like I said, about 3 minutes to talk about it, and then I'll call on you guys individually. This is your 1 minute warning, and I'll be calling on Galileo first. So 1 minute. All right, Galileo, what is going on in our big C context right now?
Quinn? The Great Depression.
The Great Depression, yeah.
Lucy? Veterans are suffering from shell shock.
Yeah.
Raven? Say that louder. They aren't getting paid very much. They're being taken.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? What about this? So the Great Depression, and we had the Dust Bowl. Oh, well, and then we also talked about the Dust Bowl, but I don't think the Dust Bowl happened quite yet at this time.
Yeah, I was a little bit further on from where we are, but I mean, yeah, that will eventually affect the country as well. All right, very good. Farmington, so can you tell us like what you think is going on for little C context for World War I veterans?
I'm confused what I'm supposed to do.
Can you tell, like, we spent the time talking about what was going on for World War I veterans. So if you were a World War I veteran in 1931 in America, What do you think life would be like specifically for you?
Trying to get enough to eat. I'm still.
Yeah, no, you're right. Definitely. They're probably unemployed. A lot of the veterans are suffering from shell shock, so they have physical and mental ailments, and they probably can't provide for their families very well. So this is kind of what life is like for them specifically, and it's a little bit harder for them than probably the average American citizen. So no, you're definitely right. All right, Landisville, what's going on for Herbert Hoover right now?
He's trying to deal with pooling money that he can't get because of the Great Depression, and nobody's able to pay any taxes he would make, and he's trying to deal with the angry veterans and that want their bonds paid.
Yeah,
So-
and
Go ahead.
also,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay, so, and also with the, along with that, along those lines, there are homeless people out there and a lot of people who don't have jobs and then they're not getting paid.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think Herbert Hoover would veto a bill just like Harding and Coolidge had done?
Do you think he would veto a bill just like?
I think he might, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep moving along here. In May of 1932, Walter W. Waters, an Army veteran, proposed that every veteran head to Washington, D.C. to demand their bonus. The movement picked up steam and spread across the country and declared the opening day of Congress, December 5th, 1932, the day they would arrive in D.C. Men, women, and children crossed the country by trains and buses with a variety of help from people, including mayors and governors and stuff like that, to eventually land in Washington, D.C. Along the way, the bonus army picked up recruits and arrived in Washington numbering between 8,000 and 25,000 men. The number of participants varied, but since many men were accompanied by their wives and children, the bonus army may have numbered as many as 60,000 people. And so I just want to take a second to explain to you guys, there's 3 different things this group is called. They call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Forces, or the BEF, and you'll see that in a lot of the documents. The newspaper and the government and even us refer to them as the Bonus March or the Bonus Army. So you will see that used too. Upon arrival, some of the bonus marchers constructed campsites on Anacostia Flats in Washington, D.C. And you can see where that is with the red text on the map right here. And if you ever get to travel to D.C., Anacostia Flats is a metro stop. Get off and take a look at it because it has some really interesting placards about what happened there. Others occupied abandoned buildings in the city. In addition to the camps in Anacostia Flats, 26 smaller camps sprung up in DC, but they were mostly in the northeast side of the city. Some observers believe that a portion of the marchers were not veterans, but communists and criminals bent on causing confrontation, though estimates of the number of criminals varied considerably. Many of Mr. Hoover's advisors and members of Congress suggested that Hoover order the army to disperse the marchers, just as President Cleveland had done in a similar situation 38 years earlier. But Hoover believed that most of the marchers were honest veterans and should be allowed to assemble as long as they did so peacefully. And remember, we saw that in the very beginning, that this is their constitutional right to peacefully assemble. And that's how Hoover saw this. And so I want to show you guys, this is what these camps looked like. The government at some point provided tents to them, but right now they're taking spare pieces of wood. You can see doors that are some of the roofs here and random lumber that is being used. And this is from a different view here. And you can see the Capitol building way in the background on the horizon. It's kind of hazy but brown. And you can see how they're starting to set up these camps on Anacostia Flats. Most bonus marchers stayed in Washington, D.C. from December of 1932 until around June 14, 1932, when the Senate voted on the bonus. The veterans published newspapers, lived in the shanties and tents provided by the government, and lobbied for their bonus. The cover of this particular issue addressed the unfounded claim that communists had infiltrated the bonus army and were agitators. The marchers made it very clear that communism was not compatible with their goals. You can also see a picture of a family here that was in the encampment. So wife, children, and this is how, one of the reasons they were there to stay for a long time. So now we're going into June. Remember, they arrived in December. On June 15th, the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill by a vote of 211 to 176. The Hoover Republicans opposed the bill because they wanted a balanced budget. Hoover threatened to veto the bill, just like we talked about. The Senate voted on June 17th. More than 8,000 veterans gathered in front of the Capitol to wait for the vote. Police raised the Anacostia drawbridge to keep back more than 10,000 veterans. Around 9:30 p.m., Senate aides called for Waters, the leader of the bonus march, to tell him that the bill had been defeated. The bill lost. And these are some pictures from that mob that was kind of outside of the Capitol waiting to find out what the bill was going to be. Many of the protesters went home. They were aided by Hoover's offer for interest-free loans charged against their bonus certificates to pay their train fare home. A few thousand remained behind, though. Again, the reported numbers vary. It is widely reported that most of the honest veterans had gone home, and that many of those who remained were communists, criminals, or other agitators who had never actually served in the military. So now we're going to use our documents to show us what is getting ready to happen, all right? On the morning of July 28th, Treasury Department officials attempted to evacuate about 40 of the protesters who had been occupying a building in downtown Washington that was scheduled for demolition. When the protesters refused to leave, the police were called in. The bonus army began to gather in force, soon outnumbering the police. Some of the policemen panicked and opened fire. 2 of the marchers were killed and a riot broke out. The District of Columbia Board of Commissioners quickly concluded that the police were overwhelmed, and they asked President Hoover to send in troops to help restore order. And you can see that in this document here. Hoover ordered Secretary of War Patrick Hurley to cooperate with the police. Hurley ordered General, soon to be General, Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief of Staff, to cooperate fully with the District of Columbia police force, which was now in charge. Surround the affected area and clear it without delay, he said. Turn over all prisoners to the civil authorities. In your orders, insist that any women and children who may be in the affected area be accorded every consideration and kindness. Use all humanity consistent with the due execution of this order. That is what President Hoover wrote. Fed up with the lawlessness and the DC commissioner's inability to restore order, Herbert Hoover wrote, "There is no group, no matter what its origins, that can be allowed either to violate the laws of this city or to intimidate the government." MacArthur thought the riot was the beginning of a communist revolution, and he may have immediately made plans not only to quell the riot, but also to force the evacuation of the campsites on Anacostia Flats and expel the bonus army from the district. He later claimed that the police superintendent had verbally requested such an action. MacArthur assembled a battalion of infantry, a squadron of cavalry, a platoon of tanks to deploy against the rioters. At 4:30 p.m., MacArthur's forces began to advance slowly, ordering groups of rioters to disperse as they encountered them. Tear gas was used when groups refused to cooperate. The soldiers at Anacostia Flats a little after 9 p.m. arrived at Anacostia Flats a little after 9 p.m. Most of the protesters had fled. Soon, the empty shacks and abandoned campsites were in flames. MacArthur claimed that he had specifically prohibited the burning of the camps and that they had been set ablaze by the retreating rioters. He ordered his forces to demolish the remaining campsites in order to prevent the fire from spreading out of control, and to gather any remaining army tents, cots, and supplies that had been given to the bonus army by the government. The next day, the troops rounded up stragglers and completed the destruction of the camps. So what did this look like? What do you think the public saw when this was happening? So now we're going to see a newsreel from the time of the bonus march. This is what Americans were going in and seeing when they went to the movies. This is the police trying to remove people from that abandoned building at the Department of Treasury. This is the troops arriving in the streets. This is the camps on fire. So I want us to also look at now some of the pictures that ran in press across the country. So we remember this is what the tent cities looked like before the government came in and decided to break apart the rioters. Now we're looking at police removal of veterans. Remember, these are World War I veterans. They're carrying clubs. It's the veterans that are now clubbing police officers. This is more of that continued struggle. This is now bonus marchers throwing bricks at the police. This is more of that scuffle where they're throwing bricks. This is what that building looked like. And you can kind of see in the middle in white writing, it says where a veteran was killed. Remember, they opened fire and they killed 2 veterans, the police did. This is them forcibly removing some of the veterans. And you can see this tall man has a bloodied head kind of behind this rope that it looks like to me the police probably set up, and we can use inferences to kind of understand this picture and what's going on. The man's holding a club too, and you can see the policeman kind of close in the corner on the right-hand side in his police hat. So we know they're police officers and they're trying to get control of this situation. So now we see the troops are starting to come in. And this is the superintendent of police, and his name was Pelham Glassford. And he was known for riding around this motorcycle in the camps every day. He was a World War I veteran, and he was very sympathetic to them. Him and another wealthy person had provided supplies, food, and cigarettes for the men when they had first arrived in December. So now the federal troops are entering, and these are pictures that were sent to Hoover after the fact. So the caption says, illustrating leisurely advance of soldiers and lack of resistance on part of the bonus seekers. So they're trying to tell this story that the bonus marchers left of their own accord. They weren't being forced. There was no violence. They just left willingly. And so this is just a formation of soldiers that were going into the camps. I think you can tell this is while they're smoldering and on fire because there's smoke. And this is the evacuation. Obviously, this is after it had been burned. And this is when they were tear gassing people to leave. The soldiers issued a warning and said, you must leave. If you don't leave, we are going to use tear gas. And they gave them time to clear out. The ones who didn't, they used tear gas and they got out. And you can see on the far left, the soldier wearing a gas mask, probably a lot like the ones they wore in World War I. And this is after effect, after they put the fires out and what the camps looked like then. This is also while it's still smoldering and the federal troops are patrolling the area. So I want you guys to spend just a minute thinking about how do you think the public responded to seeing soldiers, World War I veterans, being tear gassed by the military, by having the military called in on them to begin with, and police shooting veterans who were protesting and using their constitutional right to peacefully assemble. Do you think that maybe it wasn't peaceful as soon as they attacked the police when they didn't leave? Or do you think they had the right to assemble and the police did not have the right to tell them to leave? If somebody wants to unmute, I'd love to hear what someone's thoughts are.
I feel like they would have seen it as more violent. I don't think they would have seen it as from the soldier side. I think they saw it as like they're actually hurting the protesters.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to add anything to it?
They were scared and they didn't really like it. They wanted to get away.
Yeah. So let's take a look at some of the newspaper headlines from after this happens. This is what the media started to put out for Americans to read. And initially, the press was fairly sympathetic with President Hoover and to some extent applauded MacArthur's actions based on the assumption that the rioting was the work of criminal elements and not honest veterans. Remember, we kept hearing that. They kept saying communists had infiltrated this movement. Public reaction, however, was largely negative. Most of the nation thought it was shameful to deploy tanks, tear gas, and bayonets against unarmed veterans. In far-off Albany, New York, Democratic presidential candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt grasped the political implications instantly. He told a friend on hearing the news, "Well, this elects me." He was really sure that this was the final nail in Hoover's political campaign coffin. It was over. He was definitely going to win because the public backlash was so negative against President Hoover. So now I want to take a second and pause here for a minute again. I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes to talk to your classmates, and I'll go through and call on all of you. Do you think that President Hoover had to call in the federal troops to break up the bonus marchers? Or do you think this was a huge mistake that could have been handled a different way? So I'll give you 2 minutes and I'll call in order the same that I did before. 1-minute warning. All right, Galileo, what do you guys think? Do you think this was a mistake, or do you think President Hoover had to do this?
So we are split. So Luke, why do you think that he was wrong?
Because they're not doing anything bad there.
Okay.
But we also think that he was right. So Jason, why do you think that he was right?
Because they weren't following his orders.
And they weren't
They were rioting.
They were rioting and they hadn't followed orders. So we're kind of split.
They were rioting.
Okay. So Farmington Falls, what do you think? Do you think this was a mistake, or do you think Hoover had to do this?
I see both sides and I'm kind of split.
All right. All right, and how about Landisville?
It could have been handled better. Like, he could have tried to negotiate, but at a certain point he would have had to have called in more than just the police if it got out of hand.
Yeah. All right. So let's see what the legacy of this is. The bonus marchers did receive their benefits early. They were paid out in 1936 under Roosevelt. When the Veterans Administration began planning for the benefits for World War II veterans in the future, the bonus army was at the forefront of their decision making. That means that the impact, the historic impact of this event was that the bonus march made the government become more accountable to veterans of foreign wars. And I'll let you guys know that President Herbert Hoover established the Veterans Administration and the VA hospitals that our veterans enjoy now. The GI Bill was created in 1944 as well as part of this legacy, and lawmakers had cited the bonus march as the reason that they felt that the GI Bill was so important. So these marchers may have left home on June 14th feeling like they may not have accomplished much, and that there was violence and there was a high toll, I think, that was paid on American perception, but the impact was lasting. They did get their benefits early, and then World War II veterans were treated better because of the sacrifices that the bonus marchers made for them. That is the end of my presentation. And this is our timeline that we went through today, piece by piece here. And I just want to thank you guys for being with us. All of the documents that I used about Hoover came from our presidential papers files at the Herbert Hoover Library. A lot of the other photos and newspapers were from a variety of online archives. And I fully encourage you guys to research more and learn more about it and be interested and be curious, because there are no right or wrong answers for these questions that we asked today. All we can do is look back and ask if we were right or we were wrong and what the impact was afterward. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you guys have questions for me, I am here.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? While people think, Elizabeth, can people visit the Herbert Hoover Library? Is that something
You can. If you're ever driving down 80 through Iowa, we're right off the interstate. You can come visit us. You can also visit a lot of other presidential libraries. Dwight Eisenhower, I have his chocolate box here. He was involved in the bonus march. He has a presidential library that you can visit in Kansas. We have presidential libraries in Texas, Michigan, New York, Georgia, California, Kansas City, really all over the country. So definitely take a look, come visit all of us. If you go to Washington, DC, visit the National Archives. It's Archives 1 and Archives 2 in College Park. If you participate in National History Day, you'll get to see us a lot too, and you can stop by when you're in DC for the national contest.
Awesome. Anyone come up with any questions before we wrap up?
This is Landisville. We just wanted to say that we had no knowledge of this event in history and thought it was very interesting and amazing what really did go on. And thank you, because it was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. All right, last chance. Galileo, Farmington Falls, any questions?
So I don't necessarily, I have a question, just kind of like a comparison to homeless camps and how those are oftentimes, seen.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was more acceptable during the Great Depression because so many people were affected. But yeah, I mean, even now we see homeless camps being cleared out in a very similar fashion by police or by National Guard, and people being evicted that don't have anywhere to go.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. And thank you, everybody, for joining. We appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks again. Bye.